The sun, over the village, had not been gentle for months. It loomed like a relentless overseer in a sky the color of pale brass, beating down on the cracked earth until every blade of grass turned brittle, every leaf curled inward like a fist. The air carried no scent of rain, only the dry metallic temps of dust that seemed to settle into the lungs and never leave. It was a hunger season, the kind that scraped the marrow from bones and the hope from hearts, and it had arrived with no mercy. The land that once gave life to wheat, barley, and tall green maize now looked like an abandoned battlefield. Fields lay in ruin. What crops hadn't withered had been stolen in the night by desperate hands. The river that used to snake lazily past the village was now nothing more than a string of shallow, stagnant pools, each one guarded fiercely by the women who came with clay jars to draw water at dawn. The air was so dry that even the birds had left, their absence leaving behind an unnatural stillness. The famine had crept in quietly at first, shorter harvests, thinner animals, a few weeks of rationing, here and there, but over time, it had sunk its claws deep, pulling everyone into its grip. No one remembered the exact day when the first death occurred, but by now, fresh graves had become as familiar a sight as empty bowls, and as bellies shrank, so did trust. Neighbors who once exchanged smiles and gossip over shared meals, now eyed each other with suspicion, each wondering if the other had a hidden stash of food. Marla had seen the change happen in real time. She was only 23, yet the famine had aged her face, hollowing her cheeks and dimming the light in her eyes. The sharpness of hunger was no stranger to hurt, had been with her for months. But what startled her most was the dull ache of watching her mother, Rosa, fade away. Rosa had once been the strongest woman in the village, able to lift a sack of grain without a pause, her laughter carrying across the fields. But now she was a shadow of that woman, her bones pressing sharply against skin that had grown pale and paper-thin. Their home, a small mud brick hut with a thatched roof patched in places with scraps of cloth, had always been modest, but in better days it had felt full of the smell of simmering stews, the warmth of the fire, the sound of Rosa singing while she worked. Now, it was a hollow shell, echoing with the sound of wind and the occasional cough from Rosa's thin frame. The wooden shelves, once crowded with jars of grain and herbs, stood nearly bare. A single jar of millet sat in the corner like a taunt, its contents barely enough for one small meal. Marla had done everything she could think of to keep them alive. She had sold her hair for a handful of flour once. She had walked miles to gather wild roots, only to find the ground too hard to dig. She had even tried snaring small animals in the woods, but they too had fled or died. Every failed attempt tightened a knot of panic in her chest. She had begun waking in the middle of the night from dreams where Rosa was gone, not dead, but simply gone, and the empty space beside her in the sleeping mat would send a cold shiver through her despite the heat. It was on one of those cruel, airless afternoons when the horizon shimmered like molten metal that the trader appeared. His cart creaked and groaned under the weight of goods, sacks of grain, dried beans, salted meat wrapped in burlap. The sight of food made Marla's mouth flood with saliva, her stomach clenching painfully. The man was tall, with skin darkened from long days under the sun, and eyes that flickered constantly, measuring, appraising, deciding. He didn't smile. Men like him didn't need to. His power lay in what he carried. When he stopped in front of their hut, Marla's heart thudded painfully. She thought perhaps he had come to sell food, though she knew she had nothing to trade. But then his gaze shifted past her, to Rosa, who was sitting just inside, mending the hem of her skirt with careful, slow stitches. The trader's eyes narrowed slightly, as if some calculation had just completed in his mind. "You live with your mother?" he asked bluntly, his voice like dry gravel. "Yes," Marla answered, her throat tight. "She is strong enough to work." Marla hesitated. Rosa could barely stand for more than a few minutes. But Marla nodded anyway, not knowing why she felt compelled to hide the truth. The man tilted his head toward his cart. "I need someone to keep my house, cook, clean, tend to things while I travel." In return, he reached behind him and lifted a full sack of corn, the golden kernels shifting like coins in the sunlight. The sight nearly made Marla dizzy. It wasn't just food, it was survival, enough to feed them for weeks, maybe longer, if rationed carefully. She imagined cooking porridge thick enough to fill their bellies, grinding the kernels into flour for bread, roasting them over the fire until the air was rich with the scent. Her mouth watered at the thought, and she quickly swallowed, feeling a strange shame for even wanting it so badly. The trader's eyes met hers, unblinking. "The sack for your mother." The words fell like a stone into her chest. For a moment, she thought she'd misheard him, that the heat had warped the sound. But no, his face was calm, his tone steady. He was serious. Marla's breath caught. She turned slightly, looking back at Rosa, who had not heard the offer, her head bent over the skirt she was mending. 1,000 thoughts collided in Marla's mind, images of full bowls, of Rosa working in a strange man's home, of the shame of sending her away, of the gnawing pain of hunger that had become her constant companion. Hunger, she realized, was louder than guilt. It was a wild, sharp thing inside her, and at that moment, it roared. The sound of the trader's voice seemed to linger in the dry air long after he had finished speaking, as though the words themselves were heavy and refused to drift away. "The sack for your mother." Marla stood there, her bare feet planted on the hard-packed dirt outside the hut, her pulse a dull drumbeat in her ears. It was not just the hunger making her dizzy, now it was the enormity of what he had said. The air around her felt thick, almost solid, and each breath she took came with effort. Her eyes shifted to the sack of corn. The burlap was rough, frayed at the corners, but the weight of it sagged the man's arm. Each subtle shift of his grip made the kernels rustle faintly, a dry, tempting sound that stirred something primal inside her. Her hands twitched at her sides. She imagined lifting that sack, feeling its reassuring heaviness. She pictured pouring the kernels into their largest clay pot, the way they would catch the sunlight like flecks of gold. She saw herself grinding them into flour, baking flatbread that puffed gently on the firestone. The scent of it warm, toasty, comforting wrapped around her thoughts until her mouth ached with longing, and then she turned her gaze toward Rosa. Her mother sat cross-legged on the mat, the sewing needle moving slowly through the fabric of her skirt. She had sewn so many hymns over the years that the motion was instinctive, but now it was labored, her fingers pausing every few stitches. Her back curved slightly, and the bones of her shoulders pressed sharply against the faded cotton of her blouse. A lock of gray hair had fallen loose from her braid, sticking to the sheen of sweat on her temple. Marla's throat tightened. The image of Rosa in some stranger's house flashed unbidden in her mind-scrubbing floors, cooking meals she would not eat, sleeping in a bed that was not hers. But alongside that image came another, Rosa here, with nothing but the thin jar of millet and the emptiness in their cupboards. A vision of her mother lying too weak to rise, her breaths shallow. The slow fading that Marla had already begun to witness day by day. The choice was a knife with two blades. The trader shifted his stance, his boots grinding in the dirt. "You look like a smart girl," he said, his tone almost casual. "You know what that corn means." She did. It meant life. But at what cost? The weight of silence between them stretched until it became unbearable. Even the cicadas in the trees seemed to hold their chorus. Marla swallowed hard, tasting the dust that clung to the back of her tongue. She thought of the hunger, of how it scraped against the insides of her ribs like the edges of a dry gourd. She thought of the way her stomach had begun to fold in on itself, shrinking. She thought of the mornings when Rosa gave her the larger portion of their meal and pretended she wasn't hungry, though her eyes had lingered on the food with quiet longing. Marla knew the truth then. Hunger was not just an ache, it was a slow thief, stealing not only flesh and strength but also thought, compassion, and the ability to dream beyond the next meal. It was stripping her down to the raw core of survival, where choices were not measured in morality but in days gained or lost. Her lips parted. The words she might say trembled there. The trader's eyes never left her face. They were sharp, measuring as if he could see every thought flicker through her mind and was simply waiting for her to reach the conclusion he wanted. His hand rested casually on the sack, his fingers tapping against the coarse weave of the burlap, each tap a reminder of what was at stake. Marla's gaze kept darting between the corn and her mother. Rosa had looked up from her sewing now, sensing that the conversation outside had shifted into something heavier. Her cloudy gray eyes settled on her daughter's face. They were not pleading. Rosa had too much dignity for that, but they carried a weight, an unspoken question. "What are you thinking, child?" Marla couldn't hold her gaze for long. It was easier to look at the sack, easier to imagine the days of full stomachs, the energy to work in the fields, the chance to keep the hut from becoming another empty shell, like so many in the village. She took a slow step forward, her bare heel grinding into the dust. The trader noticed, his mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was too knowing, too expectant. "A wise daughter takes care of her family," he said. "Sometimes, that means hard choices." Hard choices. She thought of the other huts nearby, the ones where wailing had replaced laughter. Children with eyes too big for their shrunken faces. Mothers kneeling in the dirt, their hands covering their mouths as they wept over still bodies wrapped in cloth. Hunger didn't just take lives, it hollowed them out before the end. Marla's chest ached. She tried to remind herself that Rosa was strong, that her mother had survived droughts before, had walked miles with aching feet to trade herbs for grain, had mended clothes for wealthier families in exchange for scraps. But this famine was different. It was longer, crueler. There was no trade to be made when everyone was starving. Her stomach clenched, and she felt lightheaded for a moment. She imagined sitting down to a full bowl of boiled corn, steam curling into the air, warmth spreading through her like sunlight. She imagined her younger brother, barely 6, eating until his belly was round. She imagined herself not waking up every morning with the same gnawing emptiness. It was almost enough to make her forget the price. Almost. The breeze shifted, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and the sharper smell of the trader's leather satchel. Inside that sack was more than food. It was a reprieve, a bargain with death itself. But to claim it, she would have to give death a different victim. Her hands trembled. She didn't notice when her fingers curled into fists. Behind her, Rosa's sewing needle paused mid-stitch. The tiny glint of metal caught the sunlight before she lowered it into the fabric again, her face unreadable. The trader took a step closer, his shadow falling over Marla. Decide, girl. Corn doesn't wait forever. Neither does hunger. Her mouth was dry. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. The whisper that escaped Marla's lips was so faint it seemed to vanish in the air between them, but the trader heard it. His eyes gleamed up with joy, but with the satisfaction of a man who had just completed a transaction in his mind before the words were even finished. She hadn't even spoken the full sentence. She didn't have to. Her tone, the tilt of her head, the way her eyes clung to the sack of corn, more than to her mother, it all told him what he wanted to know. Rosa, however, did not move. She sat on the mat with her back straight, her sewing needle gliding in slow, deliberate motions, as if she were still in control of this moment, as if the decision were not yet final. But Marla could see it, the faint tremor in her mother's hands, the slight pause before each stitch, the subtle lowering of her gaze when their eyes almost met. Marla's throat felt tight. Her heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a dull, heavy thud. She could hear the sound of her own breathing, shallow and uneven, over the distant cries of a baby somewhere in the village. Good, the trader said softly, shifting the sack from one shoulder to the other. The movement made the corn rustle again, and that sound, dry, rhythmic, alive, seemed to fill every empty space inside Marla. It was the sound of survival, but even as the promise of food wrapped around her thoughts, a thin thread of dread wound its way through her chest. This wasn't like bartering a clay pot or a bundle of herbs. This was her mother, who had held her through fevered nights, who had taught her the songs of their ancestors, who had once gone hungry herself so Marla could have an extra mouthful of stew. She wanted to say something, to take the words back, to tell the trader she had changed her mind. But hunger is a cruel persuader, it whispered in her ear, drowning out the voice of her conscience. If you wait, she'll die anyway. If you wait, you'll both die. At least this way, one of you eats. The trader glanced toward the doorway of the hut. She can walk. Marla, voice cracked. Yes. Then have her gather her things, he said, as if this were no more than arranging a delivery. We leave before the sun is high. The decision was now, no longer hers, had slipped out of her grasp the moment she'd let the agreement live in her voice. She turned toward Rosa, who had set aside her sewing. Their eyes met fully for the first time since the conversation began. Rosa's gaze was calm. To calm Marla expected anger, betrayal, hurt, anything but this steady, quiet acceptance. It was almost worse than if her mother had screamed. Without a word, Rosa rose to her feet. The movement was slow but sure, her thin hands smoothing down the fabric of her skirt. She didn't ask questions, didn't protest, didn't even glance at the trader. Instead, she walked toward the back corner of the hut, where her small bundle of belongings lay, things worn and humble, but hers nonetheless. Marla watched in silence, her chest hollow, her hands cold despite the heat. Each movement Rosa made was deliberate, folding the shawl, tucking the comb into its cloth wrap, slipping her feet into the leather sandals she only wore on long walks. The trader stepped forward to lift the bundle, but Rosa stopped him with a single look, not harsh, just firm enough to remind him she was not cargo. Not yet. She lifted her own bundle and carried it to the doorway. Marla swallowed hard. For the first time in her life, she wished the famine had taken her instead. The air between them seemed to thicken, as though even the sun had paused to witness this moment. The trader stood a short distance away, adjusting the weight of the corn sack on his shoulder. His patience thin, but his eyes sharp, watching for any sign of hesitation. But Rosa? Rosa wasn't watching him. She turned slowly, her movements as deliberate as a queen's, until she was facing Marla fully. It was the first time since the bargain was struck that their bodies aligned. Mother and daughter standing as they had so many times before in life, when Marla was a child clutching her mother's skirt, or when Rosa had sat her down to scold her for stealing dried figs from a neighbor's tree. But this time, the space between them felt wide, a gulf no step could truly cross. Rosa's face was unreadable, not blank. Rosa had never been blank. Her expressions, even in silence, were always full of something: quiet amusement, measured disapproval, the hidden warmth of pride. But now, her features were arranged in a way that defied Marla's understanding. Her brow was smooth, her lips neither pressed nor parted in emotion, her jaw held steady, yet her eyes were a different story. They looked ancient. Marla had once read a story in an old brittle book, one her mother had traded a loaf of bread for when she was 12, about a woman who had lived through so much sorrow that her eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 years. She had thought that was a poet's exaggeration, but now, staring into Rosa's gaze, she knew the truth of it. Those eyes were deep enough to drown in. They were not just looking at Marla in this moment. They were looking through her, back into the past, forward into a future Marla could not yet see. They carried love, yes, but also resignation. And something else, something sharper, like the glint of a blade under cloth. Rosa's hand rose slowly. Marla's breath caught, her mind bracing for a reprimand, or perhaps a final act of defiance. But the hand didn't strike. Instead, Rosa cupped Marla's cheek with a palm roughened by decades of work. Her touch was warm, though not from the sun. It was the kind of warmth that had comforted Marla on nights when the wind screamed through the cracks in their hut, or when fever had left her trembling in her mother's arms. For a moment, Marla leaned into it, her body reacting before her. Mind could pull away. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids, memory flooded her. She saw Rosa's face bent over her as a child, feeding her with a spoonful of soup made from nothing but water and herbs, singing under her breath. She saw her mother's hands braiding her hair before a festival, fingers quick and sure, despite the stiffness in her knuckles. She saw herself as a little girl, running barefoot through the fields, looking back to make sure her mother was watching, and always, she was. The hand on her cheek shifted slightly, and Marla opened her eyes just in time to see her mother lean forward. Rosa's lips moved. Her voice was low, lower than a whisper, like the wind threading through the tall grass before a storm. Marla caught the words. Just 3 of them, and they struck her like a hammer to the chest. Her knees buckled, and for a moment she had to grab at her skirt to steady herself. The words were not, "I forgive you." They were not, "I love you." They were something else entirely, something that burned and soothed all at once, something that planted a seed of both hope and guilt deep in her bones. Before Marla could respond, Rosa stepped back. The absence of her touch felt like a sudden winter, a cold wind rushing in to fill the space where her hand had been. She turned away, her skirts swaying softly with the motion, and walked toward the trader without looking back. The trader shifted the sack again and moved to meet her, said nothing, perhaps sensing that words would only cheapen the transaction now. Rosa handed him her bundle, not like a servant passing over belongings, but like a woman choosing which weight she would carry herself. Then she stepped onto the road. The road shimmered in the heat, the air above it bending light into strange shapes. Each step she took made her seem smaller, not in presence, for Rosa had a way of carrying herself that defied her size, but in distance, until she was swallowed by the wavering horizon. The sound of her sandals scuffing the dirt grew faint. The folds of her skirt swayed once more, then stilled as the heat swallowed her silhouette entirely. Marla stood in the doorway, the world around her both too bright and strangely dim. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cried out. Somewhere closer, a child coughed, a dry, hollow sound. But all she could hear was her mother's voice. Those 3 words, echoing like a bell struck in the deepest chamber of her heart. The fire crackled softly in the dim light of the hut, its orange glow crawling up the walls like the hesitant touch of dawn. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of dry dust, the faint metallic temps of heat lingering long after the sun had dipped below the jagged line of the horizon. The day had been long, longer than most, filled with the hollow ache of an empty stomach and the endless, dull rhythm of survival. Fetching water from the well, sweeping the floor, though there was no real dust to chase away, sitting in the doorway to watch the road for travelers who never came. Now Marla sat cross-legged near the fire pit, the only patch of warmth left in the world. The skirt lay across her knees, not her own, but her mother's, the same skirt Rosa had been wearing the last time Marla saw her, disappearing into the wavering mirage of the road. It had been left behind, folded neatly on the low bench, smelling faintly of soap and sun. Marla had ignored it for days, unable to bring herself to touch it. It was too heavy with memory. Tonight, though, she told herself it was necessity that made her unfold it. The hem had frayed in places, and though she had no intention of wearing it herself, she hated to see the garment, the last tangible piece of her mother, fall to ruin. With her needle, her spool of faded thread, and a small clay bowl to hold pins, she began working slowly, her fingers stiff from the day's cold. The needle slid in and out of the fabric with the steady patience of someone who had mended 1,000 tears in her lifetime. Each stitch was a meditation, a rhythm that let her drift in thought without the sharp sting of regret rising too suddenly. But as she moved along the hem, her needle met resistance. Not the soft snag of a tangle in the thread, nor the roughness of an old tear, but something firmer, unyielding. Marla frowned, holding the skirt closer to the firelight. The shadows shifted, revealing the seam, a thick, clumsy line of stitching that was not her mother's usual neat handiwork. Rosa's stitches were always perfect, small, even, and tight, the kind that could hold through seasons of wear. But this was different. The seam was lumpy, uneven, and strangely heavy beneath her fingers. She pressed the fabric between her thumb and forefinger. Something inside crackled faintly. Her breath caught. It was not the familiar rustle of dried leaves or stray straw caught in a hymn. This was sharper, denser. It gave under pressure, but only slightly, like paper that had been folded many times. For a long moment, she froze. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending sparks into the air. She stared at the seam, her mind circling the possibilities. Was it trash? A scrap of something her mother had tucked away for padding, a charm of some sort, sewn in for protection. Her pulse quickened, and not from fear alone. She reached for her small pair of iron scissors, the blades dulled from years of use. But before cutting, she hesitated, an odd, superstitious thought taking hold. What if it was something meant to remain hidden? Her hands trembled, and she set the scissors down. She smoothed the skirt over her lap, running her fingers along the hem, feeling for more of the strange bulk. It ran nearly the entire length of the skirt, a steady weight that she had never noticed before. Her mother had worn this skirt for years, through seasons of planting, through funerals and festivals, and Marla had never thought to question its weight. She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips now. She picked up the needle again, telling herself she would only loosen the stitches a little, just enough to peek inside. The first threads came away easily, frayed and tired. She leaned closer, the firelight gilding the edges of her hair, and tugged another thread free. The gap widened. Something pale glimmered. Within the darkness of the seam, Marla's breath came shorter. She set aside the needle and took the scissors in hand, once more, their blunt tips slipping carefully under the next stitch. One snip, then another, and the seam began to open like a mouth unsealing after years of silence. Her fingers slipped inside. The texture beneath her fingertips was unmistakable, smooth, fibrous, and cool. Despite the warmth of the fire, she drew out the first folded sheet and held it up to the light. It was not paper from any book or letter she had ever seen. The fibers were fine, the edges crisp, and across its surface were markings, patterns of ink, numbers, symbols. Her mind struggled to name it, until recognition slammed into her chest. Money, not the small crumpled coins she had once seen pass between traders, not the few bills she had clutched tightly after selling vegetables in the market. No, these were thick, official notes, layered and bound together in neat bundles. The ink was vibrant, the numbers impossibly high. She stared, her throat tight, as she pulled another bundle free, and then another. They slid from the hem like an unending stream, each one wrapped and folded with the same precision. The weight of the skirt now made sense. It wasn't heavy with fabric or dust. It had been carrying a fortune. Her hands shook so violently she nearly dropped one of the bundles into the fire. She jerked back, clutching them to her chest as if someone might burst through the door at any moment to snatch them away. And then the truth came crashing in. Her mother had walked away with nothing. The trader, the man she had handed her mother over to, had received her for the price of a single sack of corn, never knowing, perhaps, what wealth she had been carrying all along. Or maybe he had known, and Marla had been too blind to see it. The room seemed to tilt. She pressed the bundles against her cheek, the paper cold as stone, and felt a sob rise in her throat, not just for the money, but for the unbearable truth of her own ignorance. The fire popped, sending a small ember skittering across the dirt floor. She didn't move to stop it. Her eyes were fixed on the skirt, its hem now gaping open like a wound, spilling secrets into the flickering light. The crinkle of the bills seemed to echo her mother's voice. That low whisper she had spoken. On the day she left, the words burned in her memory. And for the first time, Marla began to understand what Rosa had meant.